The Rotoworld Football crew is here to dissect our tight end rankings. Pat Daigle, Hayden, join me, Josh Norris, here for Tier 1. Tier 1 only is two names. Obviously, Travis Kelce, George Kittle, both recently paid. For so long, the first two rounds has always been about nailing running back and wide receiver. So, Hayden, I want to turn to you for this question. Why should people feel comfortable taking one of Kelce or Kittle early in their drafts and really bypassing one of those wide receivers or running backs?
Well, over the last decade, the difference between the top 5 tight ends and the lower half of the tight end ones is completely different. The top 5 have been averaging about 15 fantasy points per game. The bottom, 6 through 12, they're averaging about 10. So there's a 5 or 6 point gap. And that's not even including Travis Kelce and George Kittle, who just might be as good as Gronk from a fantasy perspective, just because they're the centerpieces of their offenses. They're both good offenses, and they're both great players. So I think them in the second round is completely reasonable. If you're not drafting a running back in the second round, I would rather be taking these guys over a Julio Jones, over a Tyreek Hill, who I love those guys. But I think that the positional value that you get from tight end is worth the gamble.
He couldn't have said it more perfectly. I mean, the positional advantage is just so huge. There's just such a enormous gulf. There have been 4 1,300-yard seasons by tight ends in NFL history, and Travis Kelce and George Kittle had 2 of them in the past 2 seasons, both in 2018. And Kittle with the injury last year wasn't quite the same, but I mean there was no drop off from either one of them. And, they're so important to their offenses, both very good offenses, that the gulf is unusually large. Even in the Gronk, Jimmy Graham years, I feel like the gulf is maybe bigger now than it was then. So there's a huge positional advantage to taking the plunge.
And this year in particular is interesting because you can't go wrong with this top tier of Travis Kelce or George Kittle. Kittle alone has only scored 4 touchdowns inside the 10-yard line the past 2 years, which is egregious given his workload and the fact that he walks into an offense likely without Deebo Samuel, at least 100% healthy for the first month of the season. And then you go to Travis Kelce, who converted only 2 of 10 targets inside the 10-yard line and 1 of 8 end zone targets last year into just a couple of scores. Both tight ends are poised to score even more this season, which makes them both prime picks and great selections at the top of at the end of the first round and the second round turn, if only to just get that position out of the way and let everyone else decipher between the rest of the guys who may or may not hit.
Yeah, there's absolutely no harm in taking George Kittle immediately after Travis Kelce. And you hit on it, Daigle. I mean, where the 49ers, while their offense has been so good, they do have room to grow in red zone touchdown percentage. They were 21st in the NFL last year. And Kittle has a season high in his career just of 6 total touchdowns. What if you see a complete blow up spot where he scores 10 touchdowns this season? That's absolutely in the realm of possibility, and it could happen this season. Okay. Let's move on over to the second tier, which is also just 2 names. We have Mark Andrews at 3 and Zach Ertz at 4. Ertz is easy, 105 at least targets in 5 straight years. Expect him to hit that even with the added wide receiver pass catchers that they have this year. But Daigle, I want to turn to you with Mark Andrews. We did see 98 targets last year, which resulted in 10 touchdowns. But he only played about 41% of the snaps last year. And surely he'll see a major increase in that. Is that why we have so much confidence in him this year?
Well, it was similar his rookie year because he only played 36% of the snaps, I believe, and yet was a top 3 tight end to finish the year with Lamar Jackson. For this year in particular, though, yes, his touchdowns may regress, but remember, he did that with a bum shoulder for half the season and yet still finished second in yards per route run behind George Kittle. So this year, his team high 23% target share from 2019, I figure only to increase since that team does quietly have 15 routes per game vacated from Hayden Hurst's departure. So yes, that could go to Nick Boyle, but it could also just mean more opportunity for Mark Andrews to explode further.
I mean, the sky is basically the limit for the reasons you guys. He flirted with 1,000 yards last year and only played 40% of the snaps. I mean, that's just crazy. And like John said, now the deck has been cleared. No more Hayden Hurst. They brought in 1 rookie receiver. There's no added target competition. And he did all that last year. Yeah, he was hurt almost all year. He played through pain basically all year. And hopefully that will not be the case this year. And so, I mean, the stars basically seem to be aligning for a player, a third-year pro who has already done so much more his first 2 years in the league than even like elite tight end prospects normally do. So, yeah, the stars seem to be aligning for Mark Andrews.
I think the ceiling is much higher with Andrews compared to Ertz, who quietly is like kind of turning into Jason Witten, just catch and fall over. And of course, the production's there, but I think there's more target competition for Zach Ertz, and there's not more target competition for Mark Andrews. So I'll definitely be siding with Mark Andrews over Zach Ertz.
Let's jump to tier 3, which is massive. We go from tight end 5 all the way down to tight end 13. I want to take the first half of that group: Evan Ingram, Darren Waller, Tyler Higbee, Hunter Henry, Rob Gronkowski. At least for me, that has kind of been the forgotten group. I simply end up taking wide receivers and running backs in drafts in that same ADP over those names that I mentioned. Hayden, am I making a mistake?
Well, not really. I think that they're kind of being priced like kind of where like they're not going to be great values, like maybe Gronk rebounds, but you have to pay like an 8th round, 9th round price tag. Same thing with Darren Waller. I will say that I think Evan Ingram and Tyler Higbee out of this group might have a little bit higher ceilings than the other guys, just because there's a lot of room for growth from both of them. And I think both of them are really talented. So those would be my picks out of that group, but you don't have to reach for these guys. These guys are like 7th, 8th, 9th round picks, and we'll get to it in a minute. The next tier is also really large too. So if you're swinging and missing, might as well swing and miss late.
So let's talk about.
It's an easy tier to ignore just because there's so many question marks in this tier, and then there's so much supposed upside in tier 4. Yeah, so Evan Ingram, we don't know about his health. Darren Waller, we know he has increased target competition. Tyler Higbee, we don't know how it's going to play out with Gerald Everett. Hunter Henry, the injury history, the new quarterbacks, and Gronk being gone. So there's a lot of upside, a lot of clear tight end 1 cases here. But you can understand why people are just skipping tier 3 and going straight to tier 4, where there's so much unknown upside that we can project onto these guys. So,
and the one to leave that tier in my mind and open it for someone else who we're probably going to discuss is Darren Waller. You missed the boat. Last year, he was going in the 11th round. And if you missed it, I'm sorry, but he's in the 5th round now with added competition. You just can't do it. And unlike Kittle and Kelsey, who are poised to score and produce even more, Waller scored on 3 of his 4 targets inside the 10-yard line. Like, it doesn't get any better than that, really. So if you missed out, you just happen to miss out. Don't chase it.
So let's look at the second half of tier 3 and beyond. Eliminate those 5 names that I mentioned. Let's kind of start with Hayden Hurst, who's our tight end 10, Austin Hooper, who I've ended up a lot with because he keeps falling, as our tight end 11. He's going as like the tight end 14 now. Anyone after that, from those names down, Pat, who was your favorite tight end to target?
In this tier? Or are you talking about beyond this tier?
Beyond Hayden Hurst, Austin Hooper, and anyone beyond that.
Yeah, I was Mike Gesicki, but I've had a lot of smart people kind of just talking me out of Mike Gesicki, and that too much of last year, he was just still inefficient and still not really that impressive of a player. So I'm kind of off Mike Gesicki. I am in on Austin Hooper because, I mean, this is still a very clear tight end 1 setup for Austin Hooper. And, you can't ignore that contract. You can't ignore he's going to a narrow offense. I mean, 2 guys who command a lot of targets, and Odell Beckham and Jarvis Landry, but then there's still like the path is clear for him to be the number 3 passing game target, and he's barely even being drafted as a tight end 1. So I think Austin Hooper can keep compiling as the tight end 1. Beyond that, I want to be on a Noah Fant, but it's so hard with all the moving parts there. He's special as a rookie, but it could be kind of one of those stalled sophomore years for Noah Fant. And someone I find myself taking from tier 4 much more. I did not think this would be the answer for me earlier in the offseason, is I have moved back on to Chris Herndon, who so the Broncos, they don't necessarily need Noah Fant. They have so many guys now they got to get targets to, whereas the Jets desperately need Chris Herndon and are, telegraphing, talking about how much they need Chris Herndon and how excited they are to unleash him again after his lost sophomore year. So Chris Herndon was not a guy I was on earlier in the offseason, but I found myself taking more and more in drafts.
If the smarter individuals talked you out of Mike Gesicki, let the fish talk you back in, because
I'm with you, Dago. I'm with you.
Allen Hurns and Albert Wilson combined for 54% of Miami slot routes last year.
I have to say, John, I was trying to cut you off. That was before they opted out. So I've been I should have put in that very large caveat. That
Good.
Yeah.
To be fair, though, in my best ball tiers and my rankings, I've been on top 10 on Gesicki all season long. And that's just because in tight ends, I think we chase touchdowns and production inside the red zone far too often for those bottom tier guys. Whereas for those guys like Ian Thomas's and Blake Jarwin, I'm just looking for usage because we don't know. And Mike Gesicki has the loose usage. He led his position in slot route last year. And with those two receivers now out of the offense, all that tells me is that his floor is that same exact usage in the slot. And maybe that doesn't come to fruition. Maybe it doesn't lead to production, but I still want all of it. So thus, I'm chasing a pass-catching tight end over the other options we argue about.
Hey, Dale, for the exact same reasons, you can make the pitch for Hayden Hurst, who is a relative unknown, but is walking into a huge, huge opportunity if he can come through with it. So these guys are like, they're flyers. These guys can easily bust, but these guys have a path to upside, and that's where you're picking from at this point in the draft.
It's why you mentioned it, Pat. I think Chris Herndon is this year's Darren Waller. It just takes blind faith at that position once you get past the confidants at the top. And I just truly believe these guys who we know are at least going to be running routes is how they engineer themselves into the top 12.
Not to end on a negative here, but circling back to Austin Hooper, Kevin Stefanski's the play caller now in Cleveland. He was with Minnesota last year. And we hear so often that they're going to run a lot of two tight end sets, and they did that at a 34% rate last year in Minnesota, the second most in the league behind Philadelphia. Yet what Philadelphia was able to do with two tight end sets was contribute the tight end 5 in Zach Ertz and the tight end 12 with Dallas Goedert. Minnesota, on the other hand, contributed the tight end 19 with Kyle Rudolph and the tight end 40 with Irv Smith Jr. And maybe that's just, a massive difference between like what Austin Hooper is a talent and what Kyle Rudolph is as a talent. But I don't know.
There's a massive difference between who the receivers were. I mean, the Eagles had no receivers, and the Vikings had two of the best receivers in the NFL is the main problem there.
I think that's a great point. And I would advise people not to be afraid, especially in best ball formats, if that's what you're drafting, to draft 2 or 3 of the names that we have in tier 4. And if you want to check out all of our rankings, the best way to do that is go and check out our premium products, which you can do over at rotoworld.com/edge. We have annual subscriptions and monthly subscriptions as well.
Hi, I'm Mike Tirico, and thanks for watching. Make sure to hit subscribe for the latest news and highlights from NBC Sports.